Hello and welcome back. This week we look at the period between World War I and World War II. The 20 years between both military conflicts was rife with disillusionment and anxiety as soldiers returned home from the brutal battlefields of World War I and tried to return to civilian society. The pessimism that had characterized the end of the Great War permeated societies across the world. The liberal order that had triumphed in the 19th century came under deep scrutiny. Challengers arose to the social, political, and economic structures that identified liberalism. In Latin America, growing resistance to the neo-colonial political and economic structures were exemplified by the Mexican Revolution, which started in 1910. In Russia, a communist regime took hold, challenging the dominance of capitalist economics. We start with the growing resistance to neocolonialism in Latin America. Throughout the 20th century, popular revolts against economic domination and political corruption erupted throughout the countries that formed this largely Spanish and Portuguese-speaking part of what had come to be called the New World. Latin America is a land of many natural resources. It covers 8 million square miles from the border between Mexico and the United States to the north, to the bottom of Chile to the south. It also includes the Caribbean for most people. In looking at this land of many resources, analysts have time and again struggled to explain why it continues to be underdeveloped economically. This is a complicated question to answer. A place to start, perhaps, is looking back at the legacy left behind by the Spanish and Portuguese that had colonized Latin America in the early 1500s. Unlike their British competitors to the north, the Spanish and Portuguese openly mixed with the local Native American populations. This mestizaje turned Latin America into one of the most, if not the most, ethnically diverse areas of the world. This mixture of different races, however, was not reflected in the governance of the land, where Europeans and their descendants, known as criollos, controlled most of the land and the structures of government. Criollos were white and considered themselves closer to their European relatives than to Native Americans and mestizos. The independence movements of the early 1800s, led by such illustrious men as Toussaint Louverture in Haiti and Simón Bolívar in large stretches of Central and South America, ended Spanish and Portuguese control over nearly all of Latin America. Modeled on the example of the newly independent United States to the north, the Latin American movements also sought to establish self-governance and democracy. As it turned out, however, the colonial powers were simply replaced by almost equally dominant criollo governments. Not interested in sharing land or power with the poorer mestizos, criollos established exclusive governments designed to ensure their continued control of Latin American societies. And so, with political and social structures basically the same, Latin America failed to develop in much a different way through the 19th century. By the end of the 1800s, most of Latin America remained underdeveloped. Trying to address this continued level of economic underdevelopment led criollo ideologues and politicians to turn to racial differences of the Latin American population for an answer. The white criollo thinkers and politicians of the time, influenced by European trends of thought, such as racist social Darwinism, attributed underdevelopment not to their own inabilities to encourage development in their countries, but to the supposed racial deficiencies they argued mixing with the Native American populations had created. According to these ideologues, the only solution to such a quote-unquote racial problem was to quote-unquote whiten the Latin American population. That would make them more like the European and North American populations that were so much more successful economically. This racist belief led to state-supported European immigration to the Americas. Argentina, for example, sent agents to Europe, especially Italy, where the local populations were desirous of leaving poverty for a chance of a better life in the Americas. The Argentinian government not only paid for the boat fare from Europe to Argentina, but would also provide the arriving Europeans with automatic citizenship and even offered them free land for them to start their own farms and businesses. The land offered was often land owned by Native American tribes still living in Argentina. The Native Americans would be ordered off the farmland and into the mountains. If they resisted, the government sent in troops to forcefully evict the Native Americans by whatever means necessary. And because the Native Americans did not want to leave the land they considered theirs, the evictions often ended with the massacre of whole tribes. And so, with the Criollo elites not interested in seriously addressing the economic underdevelopment, Latin America entered the 20th century in much the same way the Spanish and Portuguese had left it a century earlier. Overpopulation and poverty continued to be a problem, and most of the land remained in the hands of the small, white Criollo population. Lastly, even though physical colonial control by Europeans had ended, economic influences continued in the shape of neocolonialism. Neocolonialism, a form of economic colonization without physical presence, became the dominant model of economic exploitation of Latin America after its independence. Foreign countries such as the United States, Russia, and Great Britain influenced Latin American governments and obtained profitable economic agreements by supporting dictators and their military control over the local populations. The United States especially came to dominate its southern neighbors economically and politically by pressuring them, sometimes through military intervention, to accept the exploitation of their natural resources by American companies. So although most Latin American countries in this period were officially democracies, in reality they were dictatorships controlled by military men with economic support from foreign economic powers. In exchange, the dictators allowed the establishment of foreign businesses and ensured the maximization of profit of these businesses. On this slide, you can see a couple of political cartoons of the period that exemplify neocolonialism. On the left, you see Uncle Sam, representing the United States, handing weapons to the childish and selfish Latin American dictator, who was depicted as a little child to exemplify Uncle Sam's influence and control over him. The other cartoon shows the darker-skinned Latin American pulling the fatter and whiter profit maximizer dictator. And if local dictators did not follow the directives of the foreign neocolonial powers, these powers usually intervened militarily to replace the government to one that would again provide them with the social stability and control necessary to maximize their profits. The map on this slide shows the numerous military interventions by the United States in Central America and the Caribbean in the 19-year period between 1898 and 1917. Although neocolonialism did not regularly involve physical occupation, as the formal imperialism of Asia and Africa did, its exploitative nature nevertheless incited resistance from local populations. The Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century aimed to put an end to the corruption and authoritarian rule associated with neocolonial influence in Mexico. The conflict, which lasted from 1910 to 1920, was in reality a series of separate popular uprisings against the long-established dictator Porfirio Diaz, who you see here depicted by the famous Mexican artist of the time, Diego Rivera. After being re-elected to the presidency 8 times in a row, thanks to corrupt ballot stuffing, Porfirio Diaz again ran for office in 1910, and he won again. But this time, the very popular opposition candidate, Francisco Madero, refused to accept the corrupt election results. As Madero insisted on his electoral victory, popular uprisings started to break out throughout Mexico, demanding an end to corruption and the establishment of a more egalitarian democratic system of government. The Mexican Revolution lasted a decade, from 1910 to 1920, and was characterized by colorful revolutionaries such as Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. Both of them fought against an entrenched political system that privileged the rich and oppressed the poor. Their program for radical reform was reflected in their revolutionary slogan, Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom. The anti-neocolonial message of the revolution inspired support especially from the large poor population of Mexico. As the revolutionaries gained control of most of Mexico, they sat down to write a new revolutionary constitution. The Mexican Constitution of 1917 imposed radical social, economic, and political changes. For example, Article 27 of the Constitution promulgated land reform, redistributing the land of the rich and the church among the country's poor peasants. Article 123 established a minimum wage and, most importantly, forced foreign-owned companies to abide by Mexican law. Lastly, Article 130 imposed restrictions on the church and clergy, minimizing in this way the institution's heavy influence on the government. As radical as these measures were, they actually changed little in Mexico. With the exception of a short period in the 1930s, the reforms were unfortunately largely ignored, and the U.S. and other foreign countries continued to maintain a strong influence in the affairs of Mexico. We now turn to another revolution, this one in Russia. The communist revolution that struck Russia in 1917 succeeded in undermining the long-established Tsarist monarchy and replaced it with a socialist government inspired in the ideas of Karl Marx. In a matter of months, one of the most dominant and authoritarian monarchies in Europe slid into economic and political crisis and was replaced by a radically different model of government and society. The Russian Revolution saw the establishment of a communist government for the first time ever in world history. Russia was one of the largest empires in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. However, it suffered dearly against the Germans and Austro-Hungarians during World War I because it was underdeveloped industrially. The lack of adequate communication structures to connect the huge empire that spanned 13 time zones and the weakness of the imperial Tsarist government, heavily influenced at the time by the mystical premonitions of the infamous priest Rasputin, combined with a notable shortage of money which resulted from the cancellation of loans that France and Britain, also at war, you might remember, had lent to Russia. To all this decadence, one must add the imposition of an alcohol prohibition by the Tsar, concerned that vodka would cloud the minds of troops fighting at the front. As it turned out, the prohibition ended up prohibiting the Russian government from collecting close to one-third of its revenue from taxes and contributing to the bankruptcy of the Tsar's government. The economic crisis was heightened by a military crisis in the winter of 1916 to 1917, when German victories on the Eastern Front incited mass desertions from the Russian army. Food shortages led thousands of peasant soldiers to simply leave the front and return to their villages and farms. The crisis spread to the major cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow, where food riots broke out similar in form to those that inspired the French Revolution. Amidst this crisis, the government began to crumble. Of the many parties interested in undermining the established regime, the most successful was the Bolshevik Party, a radical communist group led by Vladimir Lenin. You can see him in the image here. Lenin had been exiled for years prior to 1917, but thanks to the German army, he was hustled back into Russia in time to lead a political coup in November of 1917 that placed power in the hands of the Bolsheviks in major Russian cities. Lenin and the Bolsheviks gained popularity and the communist revolution spread with their call for peace, land, and bread. The Bolsheviks established control over Russia by suing for peace with Germany. The fighting ended in early 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which granted Germany vast lands in the west of Russia, including present-day White Russia and the Ukraine. By extracting Russia from the Great War, the Bolsheviks then could turn to their attention to asserting their control over the rest of the vast Russian Empire. What followed was 4 years of arduous civil war for control of Russia. The leftist Reds, as they were known, controlled the center of the country, including the national capital and neurological center of Moscow. The opposing Whites, a conglomeration of monarchists and conservatives fighting against the revolutionaries, were strongly supported by foreign powers, including Great Britain, France, and the United States, which actually sent military units to northern Russia to fight against the communist revolutionaries. In the end, the Reds won the Civil War thanks to the centralizing initiatives of the communist leader Leon Trotsky, who successfully organized a structured army to defeat the Whites. The Red Army was also supported behind the lines by a newly organized communist secret police called the Cheka, which was responsible for jailing and in some cases torturing those that did not agree with communist policies. All in all, the Russian Civil War claimed about 20 million lives. The new communist regime renamed the Russian Empire the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. After Lenin died in 1924, the communist government came to be controlled by Joseph Stalin, who you see in this image. Stalin installed a strict Soviet governmental structure that ensured state control of the economy, resources, food, and the people. Those that did not agree with Stalin's policies were either sent off to Siberia to work in camps or simply executed. Stalin understood that the Soviet Union needed to develop economically in order to survive in the larger world. He devised the then so-called five-year plans, which aimed to increase Soviet industrial output to equal that of developed countries such as Germany or the United States. Unfortunately, the process of modernizing Soviet industry resulted in the forced relocation of millions of people from farms to newly built factory cities. The death toll that resulted reached nearly 7 million. But Stalin's elimination of his own people did not end there. In the 1930s, Stalin became increasingly paranoid of those around him and their aspirations for power. To end all possible competition for power within the communist regime, Stalin ordered the jailing and killing of millions of people, from army generals to bureaucrats, from academics to farmers. These great purges, as they were called, were typically justified by show trials manipulated to prove that Stalin's potential enemies were guilty of conspiring against the Soviet Union. In this case, over 5 million souls were either deported to the gulags in Siberia or killed. Stalin was so obsessed with cementing his control of the Communist Party and regime that he even ordered the erasing of traitors, as he called them, from the historical record. This soon became a tradition that was carried on by his successors at the helm of the Soviet Communist Party. Here, on this slide, you have an example of how this happened. On the left, you see Stalin with Beria, head of the Soviet Secret Service. On the right, you see the result of Beria falling from favor after Stalin's death. He was killed and then mysteriously disappeared from the picture. Yet, as much as Stalin controlled the Soviet Union through violence and fear, there also arose around his figure a cult of personality, which depicted Stalin as a larger-than-life figure, something you can see clearly reflected in these Soviet posters. Lastly, for today, the Soviet model soon found competition from another alternative to liberal order. As we will see next week, fascism would emerge during the 1920s and 1930s to become the third alternative in world politics between liberalism and communism. Its combination of nationalism and socialist corporatism allowed fascists to borrow from both capitalist and communist movements, while at the same time establishing itself as a singular yet viable alternative. Violence and intimidation would become its preferred form of political expression. We'll talk about fascism more next week. Until then, take care.